Today's episode was written and recorded by Suraya, Verlangen, and McKenzie Huyghebeart, with research by Noah Sander, Dante Carter, and Suraya. Audio, visuals, and editing by Aiden Woodhouse.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Grrroup's Feminism and Women in Music podcast. My name is Suraya, and I'm joined by my lovely colleague, McKenzie.
Hello.
So on today's episode, we will be discussing Revolution, Girl Style, Then, and Now.
That's right, folks. We are talking about the presence and role of punk rock, and pop punk music genres as they relate to feminism and the feminist movement throughout history and in the present day.
So before we begin, we feel it's important to provide our audience with a brief overview of the history of punk. The term itself first emerged in NYC's Lower East Side music scene of the late 70s. When we talk about punk music at its inception, bands like the Ramones, Television, and Blondie are often referenced.
Punk music and style became increasingly popular and spread throughout the UK, and its rise is tied to the Sex Pistols. British punk in the 1970s critiqued and mocked society at the time. Class politics and working class culture were primary influences of the genre and messaging.
It's important to remember that punk was a subculture that drew from existing subcultures and musical genres, styles, and aesthetics. For example, we've got skinheads, mods, rude boys, glam rockers, reggae, and rockabilly.
The punk genre and its role in culture and society at large can be defined by the tools it uses to incite political intervention and action. These tools include the genre's anti-status quo disposition, its DIY ethos, and the desire for disalienation.
So for those unaware, and I feel clarification is required because until recently this term was unknown to me, disalienation is an academic term that refers to the various forms an individual can be alienated within modern society. Now, disalienation is the practice of resistance and dismantling of the occurrence of being alienated.
In other words, the practice of disalienation, alongside the other tools mentioned, ultimately seek to both reject and challenge the world as it exists, specifically in relation to injustice and inequality.
Another tool used in the punk scene to spread the word and empower the individual was the practice of self-publishing. Independently created publications called zines, which were often handcrafted and photocopied, were distributed to spread the message and culture. So, as the punk scene that emerged from London and New York spread internationally, it evolved and soon became tied to traditional masculine ideals and identity.
The genre itself, including production style, lyrics, performance, and costumes, are naturally aggressive, which has become traditionally linked to men and masculinity.
The punk community relating to feminism and female involvement also challenges traditional notions regarding fandoms and what it means to be a fan of a particular type of music. So typically, someone is labeled a fan of punk if they attend punk shows and concerts.
Because of punk's DIY ethos, punk shows were often unregulated, located in rundown areas of town or performed in non-official venues like an empty warehouse that had been broken into.
So this often meant that shows were unsafe for women to attend, as they ran the risk of being attacked or sexually harassed both at the shows and traveling to and from them.
Because women's presence was lacking at shows, they were not considered true fans, which ultimately discounted them from the punk fandom as a whole. Female involvement in the punk scene was hidden, until Riot Grrrl, that is.
So, Riot Grrrl is a movement conceptualized in the early 90s that sought to challenge punk's exclusive association with men and masculinity that had developed.
Sexism in North American punk scenes was prevalent at the time. So, to combat the inequality of the scene, all female punk bands that sang about women's issues and female empowerment emerged and unified.
Bands that were members of the Riot Grrrl movement sang about issues of domestic abuse, rape, sexuality, and women's health. They were actively anti-establishment and spoke out against the mainstream media at the time.
Mainstream feminist movements were fighting for the right and associated respect with being called women as opposed to girls, which is viewed as diminishing and belittling.
Yes, and that's true. I myself and McKenzie as well have both experienced anger and frustration when referred to as a girl, specifically by male peers and superiors. It happens a lot. And in fact, recently, my 50-some-year-old mother was recently complaining to me about being referred to as a girl instead of a woman by her father-in-law, of all people.
Riot Grrrls took this issue and turned it on its head by reclaiming the word girl and making it a powerful one. The defiance is exemplified in the way it's spelled, packed with a punch or a threat in the form of a grrr.
Nice grrr.
Thank you.
So when speaking about the origins of the name itself, Kathleen Hanna, who's my personal idol and member of the band Bikini Kill, which was a prominent group within the movement, she said that they were angry at a society that suggests the connotations of girlhood include words like dumb or weak. So she said, quote, that girls constitute a revolutionary soul force that can and will change the world for real. Now, towards the end of the 90s, Riot Grrrl ended as a unified movement. It has had a long-lasting influence on women in punk, publishing, and music as a whole.
We would like to acknowledge that we are not drawing direct parallels, meaning we are not insinuating that the female artists we are about to talk about stem and are influenced directly by the Riot Grrrl movement, nor traditional elements of punk music and culture.
Yeah, agreed. This is important. However, when our team began discussing the evolution of punk and women in the genre, it felt impossible not to tie these artists into the trajectory and evolution of women in punk and women in music as a whole. And we hope that you'll see why.
The success of Riot Grrrl in both music and feminism can be attributed to the movement's ability to, quote, foster an affirmative mode of public female self-expression that didn't exclude, repress, or delegitimize girls' experiences, end quote. It was about making connection with other girls and women, building a feminist and political consciousness. After Riot Grrrl fell as a unified movement, the media shifted its focus to the pop-punk artists that were emerging. Women in pop-punk didn't shy away from addressing social issues they experienced, specifically in relation to men. They were often lumped together as angry women in the music industry, despite the fact that there was plenty of diversity in both musical style and lyrical subjects.
So many of these angry women's issues were similar to those of the Riot Grrrl bands who came before them. For example, reclaiming misogynist terms and addressing sexual abuse in their lyrics. However, these new feminist heroines of music became far more commercially successful because of their appeal to mainstream media and popular culture. For the most part, these artists' music was produced to fit into the pop variety that has historically done so well on the radio, as opposed to the angry punk style of Riot Grrrl bands.
These female artists that emerged on the scene tended to follow the traditional interview procedure of answering questions. This, coupled with a more pop-influenced music style and stereotypically feminine appearance, allowed them to be angry and sing angrily about issues of substance without being threatening.
So now we need to discuss Alanis Morissette, who many point to when they think about mainstream angry women in music. Morissette's combined anger, raw, and sometimes sexually graphic lyrics with a tune catchy enough to capture the mainstream. She became popular, and her single You Oughta Know gained mass attention, and it remains popular to this day.
Music publications claimed that Morissette was a trailblazer that helped in creating a, quote, whole new genre for female performers that allowed them to assert their ideas about feminism and sexuality, end quote. However, one could argue that what Morissette put out was merely a commercialized version of earlier groups of female musicians associated with Riot Grrrl.
Now, according to Morissette herself, she experienced isolation, misperception, competition, and jealousy in an industry that was primarily male-dominated. She's indicated that she feels it is part of her job to partake in social activism because of her role in the spotlight, and most likely also because of what she's experienced as a female artist.
Next up is pop-punk darling Hayley Williams of the band Paramore. In the early 2000s, Paramore took the pop-punk scene by storm. Mainstream media have given her a number of titles, including Punk Princess and the 21st century's pop-punk prophet.
Quite the resume. Paramore was one of the first female-fronted acts that performed on former NYC Riot Grrrl Shira Yevin's side stage. So this was a performance space dedicated to bands with a female lead. Many deemed Williams a pioneer for female punk and punk pop artists. Her aim was to continue to help create space for women in the punk scene. However, she has ultimately made the standard for other female artists of the same genre and drew attention of journalists and critics towards herself and her band, subsequently drawing attention away from others.
Paramore's music was well received by both punk and pop scenes because the band used a melange of loud guitars, mixed music tones, and pop-style lyrics.
Now, Williams has spoken about a lack of young women in the punk scene and how that has contributed to her own personal sense of loneliness, which has manifested into a pressure to fit into a punk boys club. She has felt she has to work twice as hard as her male counterparts to prove her talent and solidify her role and presence in the genre.
On that note, Williams actually fell into a participatory role in sexism and misogyny with her song called Misery Business, where she shamed another woman for stealing her boyfriend.
In a 2017 interview, Williams actually expresses regret about writing this song. She explains that it is difficult to be a fan of the pop-punk genre and not internalize some of its misogyny. The lyrics to Misery Business were pulled directly from Williams' diary. Paramore no longer performs this song as a part of their act. So, before we conclude, I think we need to briefly shed light on exclusionary practices towards the transgender community in punk culture. Despite the fact that punk has historically played a key role in allowing individuals or enabling individuals to deconstruct gender norms, trans people, and specifically trans women, are often not acknowledged in the punk scene.
Gender-based ambiguity and androgyny are common styles in the punk scene. Expressive styles associated with punk were labeled drag or generalized as countercultural or a form of social protest. This can act as a form of diminishment of the presence of trans people in the punk scene. It's difficult to know how many trans people have existed in punk over time.
Another method of exclusion in the punk scene we feel should be touched upon is a form of gatekeeping that we notice that is practiced when it comes to the comparison of sort of traditional female punk artists of the 90s and Riot Grrrl and turn-of-the-century pop-punk icons that emerged and continue to exist today.
Please note that our focus on mainstream pop-punk acts should in no way diminish the all-female and feminist underground punk rock groups and scene that continues to exist today.
With that said, the appropriation of subcultures by the mainstream is a continuous and not inherently negative process, and it's counterproductive to indicate that pop punk and female artists that pertain to the genre are simply co-opting the punk aesthetic and using it for personal profit.
Feminism in music should work to be as inclusive as possible. It was interesting to see our class jump at the chance to criticize Avril Lavigne, or for one of our assigned texts to suggest that the appropriation of the term girl power and its underlying meaning by the Spice Girls and Lilith Fair was superficial and undercut the Riot Grrrl movement.
Female artists who choose to solely identify with the punk genre are much less likely to be noticed by a pop-dominated industry than men.
Today, female artists are constantly compared to one another, leaving little room for the emergence, representation, or ownership of new styles. Women in the music industry feel constant pressure to reinvent themselves and present consumers with something new, otherwise they are often left by the wayside and deemed irrelevant.
Female visibility in punk remains difficult, and as a result, younger artists lack the confidence and encouragement to pursue the genre. Male-dominated culture in punk and in music persists, but sociocultural winds continue to shift in the music and in the world.
If the Riot Grrrl movement taught us anything, it's that the underground, alienated, anti-establishment individual can incite change that echoes and alters the fabrics of society for decades.
Well said. So thank you so much for listening to Grrroup B's Feminism and Women in Music podcast. We hope you enjoyed our episode on punk. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you.
A pleasure.